I love a good story. And there is this new book out. You might have heard of it. It's called Sapiens. Wow. I personally haven't read it yet, but my husband has been listening to it on his commute, and he's always telling me the coolest things about the history of human beings, like this. One of the distinguishing characteristics of humans, and one of the main reasons we have been able to organize ourselves into large groups that don't fight over every scrap of food, is our ability to tell stories. It seems that our stories connect us to one another, forming a shared identity around history, religion, or other commonalities. Our stories help us understand ourselves as part of a community. If we share a common story, we're more likely to share other things as well, like food, space, even empathy for one another. Without stories, we would be little different from the other primates. That's what brings us together, isn't it? A shared story. We are all here because of our commitment to Jesus' story, which shapes how we see ourselves in the world. We tell his story so that we can locate ourselves in it, becoming part of something bigger than our own individual needs at any given moment in time. When we see Jesus, we see something in ourselves, even if it's only aspirational. And when we hear these stories together, we immerse ourselves in our shared spiritual tradition. So today we meet Jesus at the banks of the Jordan River, but he is not alone. Crowds of people have gathered, not because of him, but because of a dynamic preacher named John, who is also called John the Baptist because part of his teaching was that people needed to change their hearts and minds, clean up some old thoughts and attitudes, and an outward symbol of that spiritual freshening up was a literal washing. John would bring people into the Jordan River, pull them under as if to drown them, but then he'd raise them back up, sputtering like infants learning to breathe air for the first time. And it all represented spiritual renewal, a change of heart and mind. John's followers were embracing a new way of living, a way that he hoped would prepare the way of the Lord for someone he promised was coming, someone way more significant than he. He was only the messenger, getting people ready to meet the Messiah who would be chosen by God to help people align with God's will for them. Here's how Matthew tells this story from chapter 3, starting with verse 13. Then Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" But Jesus answered him, "Let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness." Then he consented. And when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." Everyone heard that voice. It was a communal epiphany. However special the moment might have felt for Jesus, it was not his personal moment. It was now everybody's story, and they would share it from that point on. And in retelling this story thousands of years later, we claim it as ours too. We understand baptism. It's something we do here in our church, and whether or not we've all been through the waters of baptism, we at least have a collective understanding of what it means. Our baptismal story connects us somehow to Jesus' baptismal story. He went to the waters just like the rest of them, taking the next step in a faith journey that they walked together. In spite of John's protest that Jesus was too good for him to baptize, Jesus insisted on joining the community, sharing their story, and allowing them to share his. But the story is older than Jesus, older than John the Baptist, older than everyone gathered that day at the Jordan River. What happened that day was indeed a new thing, but everyone who knew the old stories heard the echoes of ancient words, just as the Spirit of God fell upon Jesus when a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, whom I dearly love. I find happiness in him." That sounded a lot like this. "Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my soul delights. I have put my Spirit upon him." Those were the words spoken by the prophet Isaiah nearly 500 years before on behalf of God. Isaiah was giving the people a message. They were God's servant collectively. They brought God delight. God's Spirit was upon them. That was their story, the one that had shaped their identity for hundreds of years. So to hear those words again, not through the voice of a prophet, but from the very heavens, It reminded Jesus' people of their identity while confirming the identity of that man just emerging from the water, dripping wet as their Messiah, the one chosen by God. God's Spirit was indeed upon him, and God delighted in him. That's part of our identity too, as Christians baptized in the same tradition. We recognize that the Spirit of God is also upon us and God delights in us. And that is a huge part of what we celebrate today on the Sunday dedicated to the baptism of Jesus. Today is the day when we remember our baptisms and are thankful. And if we have not been baptized, then we're invited to consider it, for it is a sacred ritual that's held meaning for Christians since the time of Jesus. But what is it really? Is baptism necessary as a ticket to heaven? Some folks think so, and in certain traditions, even babies are baptized in a terrible hurry if they look sickly, just in case. That is not the United Methodist understanding, by the way. We do not believe that baptismal status makes a person any more or less acceptable to God. Rather, we believe that God's grace is always with us from the very beginning and will not be withheld because we didn't make it to the fountain in time. And yet it's important to us. We only recognize two sacraments, and one of them is baptism. The other is Holy Communion. These are both things that Jesus instructed his followers to do, and we take that seriously. We consider both communion and baptism to be means of grace, ways in which we experience God's grace, which transforms us as we endeavor to live into the story of Jesus and follow his way. Baptism is an essential part of that story, not because it was when God said yes to Jesus, but it was when Jesus said yes to God. In our baptism, we too are saying yes to God. Or if you're baptized as an infant like I was, those who spoke on our behalf were promising to lead us in the direction of yes, which we would affirm later. Our baptism is important because it brings us into a community of faith, all of whom pledge to nurture us on our faith journey, saying yes when we can't find the words or if we ever have trouble believing them. The baptismal vows are not taken alone. They are echoed and affirmed by the congregation, which promises its support, for the covenant made with God is not only personal, it's also communal. Remember the collective witness of the gathered community who heard all at once the voice of God calling Jesus the beloved Son and expressing delight in him? They were not only celebrating one beloved Son of God, they were celebrating the beloved community. But as wonderful as it is to celebrate our own belovedness, there is more to it than that. The words from the prophet Isaiah that identified all of the people as chosen by God, bringing God delight, there's more to that one too. It's a whole song, a divinely inspired work of poetry that expresses the relationship between God and God's people during a time when they were being reshaped. You see, they had been taken into exile after being defeated by their enemies, and after several generations in faraway Babylon, they were preparing to return to their homeland, where there would be lots of work to do. Those who had been left behind were bruised and battered physically and spiritually. They would need tending. And the ones who had done the bruising and battering, the descendants of their enemies, God saw them as beloved children too, and that's where the plot thickens. God's people returning to their homeland would have a huge responsibility in their collective role as God's beloved servant to serve all of the people with humility so that God's will could be made known to everyone in every way possible. Here is the continuation of the song from Isaiah 42. Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be crushed until he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his teaching. Thus says God the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to the people upon it, and spirit to those who walk in it. I am the Lord, I have called you in righteousness. I have taken you by the hand and kept you. I've given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison, those who sit in darkness. I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I give to no other, nor my praise to idols. See, the former things have come to pass, and new things I now declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them. It was the dawning of a new day for the beloved people of God, and their mission was before them to bring justice to the land. God had called them to this, called them for that reason. They had been chosen not as the sole recipients of God's favor, but as the servants who would live out God's justice in the world, not with loud shouting or aggression. No need to break those who were already bruised, no shaming of those whose wicks were faint. They were to bring light to the nations, meaning all people, regardless of their story. Using God's favorite tools of justice, mercy, and love, they would make others part of a new story, the one God was using them to create. That is the current that was running underneath the surface of the Jordan River the day Jesus was baptized. That was the story behind the words heard from the heavens. And that is the story into which we are still being written. Our baptism is our covenant with God, not my personal covenant, but our collective covenant. And it is bigger in scope than we might realize. It extends beyond the walls of any one church, and it goes into the world that God so loves. For part of the covenant is to answer the calling that God has placed upon our lives, to bring justice to an unjust world by living justly and advocating for mercy and showing extravagant love to all, so that the whole world may be lit up with the light of God's grace. It's not about our personal salvation, but about the salvation of the world, meaning the liberation of the oppressed, the healing of the hurting, the loving of the unloved. It's deep water indeed, but it is our story and we need to know it. As we reaffirm the covenant of our baptism, remember that the calling of God is strong upon you, just as strong as it was upon Jesus and upon his ancestors. For the Spirit of God, who spoke all creation into existence, who breathed life into all people, is alive and well in you even now, calling you beloved and delighting in you. You were called beloved for a good reason. We all were. And we are in it together as we remember our baptism and are thankful. I thank God for you and for the story that unites us all. As we remember the story together, I invite you, if you like, to dip your fingers into some water, sprinkle some on your head, or maybe gently trace a cross on your forehead, remembering that you too are called beloved by God. Whoever you are an essential part of God's beautiful story, beloved. Water, rivers, be